Takes a couple seconds.
On now.
All right, I will call to order the Tuesday, March 9th, 2021 Oxford Planning Commission meeting. We will start with the approval of the agenda. I do have a change to the agenda. If we, Sam, are you ready on that change?
Sure. Yeah, I did want to mention that under 6, it should say old business for the first case, and then new business should be for the second case, 03. So it's not a change in order, it's just a change in title, just for the general public to see that it's actually an old business case is coming back. So we're so used to doing cases in one night, we didn't change the label. So
And also the reason Sam and I wanted to highlight that is the order, or not the order, but the sequence will be slightly different simply because this is a continuation. So are there any other additions, changes, or corrections to the agenda?
Possible to make a suggestion regarding order?
Sure.
Well, what I guess my point is that by far the greatest amount of time will be consumed by PC 2020-18. And the other items will consume lesser amounts of time. And it's just throwing it out there. Sometimes people like to reverse the order so that the most exhausting case is at the end.
We should by protocol, we should finish any unfinished business before we go into new business, just
right
by a consistent order. So I would prefer to do the old business item and wrap that up. Great point. I do appreciate that, but I believe we should wrap up the old business before we begin new business.
I'm
Mr.
with
Keebler.
you.
I would move to approve the agenda as amended.
All right, Mr. Keebler has a motion. Do I have a second, please?
I have a second.
All right, Mr. Dana just beat Ms. Blackmar to the second. All those in favor of the agenda as amended? All right, all of the hands are up indicating consent. All right, now we will move on to the approval of the February 9th, 2021 minutes. Do we have any additions, changes, corrections to the minutes? If no, I will entertain a motion to accept.
I accept.
Move to accept.
All right, Mr. Dana made the motion, and I will assume Ms. Rosenberg is good making the second. All right, all those in favor of approving the minutes as presented, raise your hand, please. Let the record show all commission members raise their hand in affirmative. All right, at this time, Sam, do we will have public comments related to items that are not on the agenda. So if you are a member of the public and you would like to comment on something that does not appear on tonight's agenda, please indicate so in the chat or raise your hand and Mr. Perry will recognize you.
Mr. Chair, no one has hands raised at this time.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Now we will move, excuse me, we will move on to reports from boards, commissions, and our staff. If it's all right, I will start and then I'll just go top to bottom. So Mr. Dana, do you have anything you'd like to report from your affiliations to this commission?
I would just briefly point out what's happened at the latest meeting of the CIC, the Community Improvement Corporation, and they're retooling they're sharpening their tools for applicants. That is, they are simply saying, these are the rules that will guide your application. And I think they're putting a very fine point, doing a good job of making it easy for people to use the revolving loan fund. End of matter.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Prithridge, do you have anything to share with the commission?
Well, one of the things that when I was on planning commission, we never had any idea council did with what we recommended. So rather than report from a board, I just wanted to let you know that the Care Road, the PUD on Care Road had its first reading and is ready for a second reading. And the second reading on that first Lake Forest PUD was approved with a number of conditions, but I just want to express that the planning, the council really appreciated all the work that the PC went into it. And like I say, sometimes on PC, we never had any idea what happened. So that's that you, so
all right. Thank you, Dr. Prithridge. Mr. Keebler. Mr. Keebler has nothing. Mr. Bracken?
Mostly a continuation of previous projects, still looking into solar, still doing inventory of greenhouse gases, looking into a pollinator city and other such features, but not too much new, just working on those.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rosenberg, do you have anything to report from your boards and commissions?
Yeah, so Housing Advisory Commission, our last meeting, we went over the housing study that was published on the website subsequently after that. And then we got ready for our work session that we had with City Council that night. And the cool thing to report on that is one of the top goals for City Council this year is to look into incentives for affordable housing to developers. And I'm happy to say that that's an initiative that really, I think, came out of Housing Advisory Commission with the work that I and others in that commission did. So just super glad to see that that is at council's feet now, and I'm sure some great work will get done.
It would help if I unmuted. Ms. Blackmar, do you have anything that you would like to share with the group?
Yeah, our Oxford Parking and Transportation Advisory Board met on Monday, and we had several items for discussion. One was our plans for building a platform for Amtrak and the general status of the Amtrak potential future stop in Oxford. And that is a somewhat complicated situation where our future stop is contingent upon federal and state funding and plans. However, the city is moving forward with plans to get different scenarios for a platform for Oxford. And that's definitely an area where at various, you can look on the city's website, there is a new posting, I believe, with a press release that details the city's plans at this point. And that would be a good thing to share because there's a somewhat vaguely written news article is going around right now that could stand for some clarification. So I encourage everybody to check out the city's website for the press release about our Amtrak program and to just help get the word out that if we want to see that happen in our city, it would be really good to communicate the value of that to others and to your elected representatives at a state and federal level. We also talked a little bit about the subsequent phases of Oxford area trail planning and about our ongoing issues with sidewalks, snow removal, and how we might look toward addressing that in future years. So it was a very productive meeting, and you'll be hearing more about those issues.
Thank you very much. The only thing I have to contribute is tomorrow we will have the HAPC meeting. We don't have any business items, but we are slated to meet with Mr. Spurlock from the Smith Library of Regional History. And we're also going to have some updates on the Freedom Summer access and then our design and decision standards, as well as a historical plaque. So mostly just housekeeping and getting some of our nuts and bolts in order for future business. Mr. Perry and Mr. Moore, do you have anything to share on behalf of our city staff?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did have an OKI, our regional planning organization meeting today, brief meeting, just a project meeting to discuss how the funding applications work, because there's a deadline coming up in June that we'll be working towards for some grant applications for the Oates Trail project continuation. Also, I will let everyone know, I've mentioned this in the past, I believe, that the community strategic plan, aka comp plan update, is working behind the scenes, and there is a meeting with board and commission chairs that are appointed by council next Thursday afternoon, and several have been invited already for board and commission chairs as we start to assemble and recommend steering committee members. So we will keep you informed as to how that's progressing. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for the record and information, Ms. Rosenberg will be representing the Planning Commission as our official representative. So she will have a lot more to report back in future meetings. I do apologize. For some reason, my computer decided it wanted to close the agenda. So if there are no other reports from boards, commissions, committees, or staff, we will move into old business. So seeing as this is a continuation of a previous discussion, I did speak with Sam and Zach. The old business item is PC 2020-18. It is preliminary subdivision for Lake Forest Drive. It's 17.97 acres. The proposal is for 21 single-family lots, and Four Leaf Development LLC is the applicant. Because this is a tabled item, before we can do anything, I need to entertain a motion to Dr. Prithridge.
Yeah, so I would move that we take PC 2020-18 off of the table.
All right. Do I have a second?
I second.
All right. Ms. Blackmar beat you to it, Mr. Dana. So the motion is Mr. Prithridge and second by Ms. Blackmar. There is no discussion on a tabling or untabling. So all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Let the record show all the commissioners have raised their hands. So this matter is off the table. I have asked Mr. Moore simply for the efficacy of the discussion to do a brief recap, not only to capture the essence of the discussion, the presentation, I'm sorry, that the staff gave last time, but also there's some work that city staff has done in the meantime. So I've asked him to lead our conversation off by framing the discussion. So Mr. Moore.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go ahead and share my screen with everyone. Okay. So again, this is PC 2020-18 that's been taken off the table. This was originally brought to the Planning Commission last month at the February 9th meeting. And this again is a preliminary subdivision request. The name of the subdivision is South Forest Edge. I'll try to keep my presentation as brief as possible. It's broken up into 5 different subjects, which I believe have emerged from the prior staff report and prior discussions with the commission in February. So I'll go through each of these topics one by one. And of course, the staff memo, which you've got a copy of, addresses these by topic as well. So beginning with the first topic, which is the potential stub street connection. So just to recap what we heard. So we did hear from the applicant represented by Etta Reed, who's again with us tonight. We heard from 2 of the nearby property owners who live off toward the east in Oxford Township along Woodruff Road. And the applicant, as well as these owners, were opposed to having a stub to the property. And there were a number of reasons that was cited. The property to the east is not in the city. It's not currently sewered. And the property owners voiced their position that they didn't see the potential in the future for development of their property. So those were some of the reasons that were given as to not to provide a stub street. But just to recap where staff was at the time. So the issue at hand here is compliance with a standard in our subdivision regulations, which says that there is supposed to be a minimum connectivity index of 1.2. So the way that the applicant had proposed it was to basically propose the street network that you see here minus the yellow areas that are highlighted there. So it's essentially a loop street with 2 knuckles off of Lake Forest Drive. That would bring the index number down to 0.5. What staff had recommended was providing 1 stub in whatever location it may be. There's 2 potential locations that are shown here, number 1 and number 2. At this time, number 1 is staff's preferred location. Number 2 is the next best option, in our opinion. So providing either stub street or paper street in either of those locations should bring the index up to 1 versus the 0.5. So it makes it more compliant. But as was stated before, and I think was reflected in discussions as well, this is somewhat in competition with the goal to curb sprawl and maintain rural character. I think that came through in the discussions. And kind of my takeaway from everything was it seemed like the commission was leaning toward maybe not providing a stub, maybe accepting of the waiver request to bring it down to 0.5. So it got me thinking about it, and I did have some phone discussions with the applicant on this one. So I think I've come up with a suitable alternative that tries to balance the various interests at play. So what I'd like to do is show you a little bit more with option number one, potentially how that could play out as far as providing the potential, at least for a stub connection, but maybe not constructing the street all the way to the eastern edge, which is what I think the primary concern, at least with the adjoining owners, is all about. So here is a graphic just showing the original plan that was submitted. So this is a zoomed in view of the southeast corner. So I've got the property lines shown in black, and then the potential connections for driveways shown as red arrows. So if the commission were to entertain option A per the memo, so this is the preferred option. So normally when there's a stub street provided, the street itself is built all the way to the edge of the property line. So normally it just goes all the way up. And there is a spec in our subdivision regulations. It's in attachment H of the regulations for a temporary turnaround feature. So this is basically like a temporary cul-de-sac that allows for emergency vehicles and other larger vehicles to be able to make a 180-degree turn so that they can turn around and go back the opposite direction in a forward motion without having to back up into anybody's driveway. So there's essentially temporary pavement that's installed on either side of the curb. If you've been out to Northridge subdivision, there's actually two examples of these, one on Honor and one on Dufour. So that's essentially what we're showing here. So the lighter gray would be the temporary pavement. It's at a 45-degree radius is what results here. That's per our spec. So what we're proposing is not building the street all the way to the edge, but rather building it probably around 2/3 the way there, enough to provide driveway access to these lots over here. So if I flip back and forth really fast, you'll see that this will have to entail some reconfiguration of the lot lines. So it takes away these kind of wedge or pie-shaped lots, makes them more standard here on the south side, increases the size of lot 9. So it results in the same net number of lots. It would still provide for driveway access for all of these, but there would be hopefully a roughly 60-foot gap where it would be dedicated right-of-way, would exist on paper and be a part of the city's territory, but without the need to actually go in and clear out the trees that are situated there at present. And the only time where that may come to pass is, of course, if the property to the east ever developed or if it developed. But we see this as the best option because this provides at least the potential where you have this outlet that could be plugged into. If you don't provide for this now, chances are the chances of punching a street through somebody's private lot is going to be slim to none. So this is the time to do it. Okay. So topic number 2 is a buffer along the eastern edge. And this was a concern that was, I think, mostly inspired by the comments that we heard from Mr. Schulte and Mrs. Berger, excuse me, who live off to the east of the property. And they're concerned that a lot of those woods may come down for the sake of development. So this more or less emerged as a topic of discussion. And if you recall, we did end, we had a pretty significant segment toward the end there about the tree ordinance compliance. So this is mostly about that. So revisiting that subject. So I thought I'd revisit this slide. This is a slide from my previous PowerPoint. This was showing the option for a conservation easement or area, which our code does allow as an option for fulfilling the tree ordinance without having to survey. And this is the area that was delineated as a part of that. So if the developer were to pursue this option, then the area in green here, which is a little over 5 acres in size, there's a potential for an in lieu fee with that, or to reserve that as either an easement or a deed restriction. But what was agreed before the February meeting, staff had presented 4 different options that were outlined in the previous report. The applicant chose to essentially defer the tree surveys to the building permit stage. So that was where we were starting from. But I think this discussion about worrying about, okay, trees could still come down even if there's the surveying at the beginning with the building permits. What do we do about that to better ensure that as much of that vegetation remains protected as possible? So what has come about since then? So staff has had conversations with the applicant about maybe putting in a conservation area restriction on the record plat itself. So again, this is an option that the tree ordinance provides for compliance. It's a covenant that goes on the plat. It's basically a deed restriction that says these areas cannot be clear cut. You can maintain them, you can trim out invasive vegetation, you can remove dead or fallen trees, but ultimately you cannot clear cut these areas. So that would go in as a private covenant. The applicant has agreed to this, but only for a 30-foot width along the, I believe it's only along the eastern property line is what they've agreed to. Staff feels that it would be better if we increased it to 40 feet versus the 30 feet. And the reason for the 30 feet that they were in agreement with that is actually the rear yard setback for the R2A district. So that's where we were starting from, the 30 feet. Staff feels it should be increased to 40 feet. And then the other thing to mention, there was a previous condition that really didn't get discussed at the February meeting, but it had to do with the steeper slopes that are here in the northern part of the site. You notice that the green area up there is a little bit bulkier. There was a previous condition that the applicant agreed to, which was to increase the rear yard setback for those areas. So in light of the further clarity that we've received on the conservation area potential, the deed restriction that goes with that, we feel like this condition could be updated so that it reflects an 80-foot depth, which I think is pretty clear. You can see the contours in that area that are closer together that indicate steeper slopes. So we feel this is a reasonable restriction and kind of goes in line with the prior recommendation, which was to help to better preserve those areas and not have them be built upon with structures and development of any kind. So at this point, the way it stands right now is that the tree surveying component still remains. So this is in essence going above and beyond that. There is sort of this balance between, okay, if the applicant agrees toward doing a conservation area restriction, maybe something that's a little bit greater than what's shown here, does that mean that the spirit and intent of the tree ordinance is more or less fulfilled at that point? And can we just essentially release them from the burden of having to do the surveys as part of the building permits? We haven't really come to a conclusive determination on that, at least at the staff level, but certainly the commission can entertain sort of the balance between, okay, if we have this conservation area restriction, does that get us where we want to be without having to impose the additional burden of the surveying at the building permit stage? So just to demonstrate why we feel 40 feet is a better distance than 30. So this is the sample tree survey that was provided. This was for lot 9. So as you can see here, this is a 30-foot distance shown in green. So it does capture some of the significant tree specimens. One of those, which is a 10-inch maple, is pretty much right on the line. But if you bump that out to 40 feet, all of a sudden, there's at least 2, maybe 3 other trees that are included. So it may be deceiving to look at that and go, oh, 30 feet sounds like it's plenty. But when you actually take a look at the significant trees and where they're located per this survey, I think it makes a lot of sense to take that rear yard area, which is essentially already about 80 feet wide, which is the area that's not hatched on this survey. So it's kind of splitting it down the middle. It's going half and half. It's going, half of it can be for accessory uses, pools, sheds, that type of thing. The other half would just be a nice vegetated buffer that would be on the private lots, but it would be, a nice screening and privacy effect that would result from it. Okay, I'm going to take a drink here really fast. The third subject is the buffer along Lake Forest Drive. So this is specific to lots 20 and 21. And I think this is heavily influenced by whether or not there is a homeowners association or not. So when there is a dedicated association that can, maintain the landscaping, trimming, mowing, that type of thing, it becomes more acceptable at that point to have, other elements other than just vegetation. You can have mounding, you can have fencing, have, a variety of different features. But if there is no HOA, I think we need to maybe revisit, exactly what sort of shape or character does this buffer portray at that point, if the buffer itself is to be later inherited by the private owners of lots 20 and 21. So it's trying to at least establish that buffering ability along Lake Forest Drive to screen the backsides of these lots from sort of the main collector thoroughfare, and have the developer be responsible for that, have it bonded, make sure that they put it in place. But once it goes in place and once the developer essentially is done with the project, these would ultimately become, private homeowner responsibility. So I think at that point, having some evergreen vegetation, that way there's more of a year-round screening effect, arborvitae, evergreen trees, shrubbery, that sort of thing, would be probably the best thing to do under those circumstances without an HOA. And I think the applicant is willing to have their landscape architect with Bear Becker to actually draw up some plans in time for the council meeting. So that way we have an exact plan that is tied to the approval, that we know exactly what to expect, rather than that sort of thing getting sorted out at the construction drawing phase, which is more administrative, more internal to staff. So that's kind of the direction we think this one is headed in. Subject number 4 is the lot 16 building pad location. So what was presented before was that lot 16, we thought it was an odd location for standalone dwelling near the intersection of Lake Forest and 27. It appears somewhat detached from the rest of the subdivision. So looking at it a little bit further, I think if the commission was willing to entertain the positioning of a unit in this location, and again, kind of similar to the last subject, I think a lot of this rides on whether there's an HOA or not, because if there isn't an HOA and there is no unit in this location, and there's certainly no stormwater feature at that location, then that's just going to be empty ground, probably, a grassy area that's going to need to be mowed and maintained. And who's going to maintain that? It would just be an odd sort of responsibility, especially if you went with more of a panhandle style configuration of moving lot 16 or building pad 16 a little further to the east. So I think the solution that's presented here is going off of the assumption that if there is no HOA, what's the next best alternative? So what is shown here, so looking at the surrounding environment, looking at the setbacks that are already in place, there are residential units that are there to the west of 27. Those are, there's 2 of them there that are actually set back at about the same distance. They're about 100 feet from the center line of 27. So in that case, I think it would make a lot of sense that this unit be positioned at least to that exact setback, measuring 100 feet from both the center lines of 27 and Lake Forest. So that's exactly what this exhibit shows here, is bumping that setback further back toward the interior of the lot. You can see kind of the original 30-foot building line that was proposed. So it is definitely increasing it quite a bit from where it was before. So having that extra distance there will make for a less imposing presence for that particular dwelling in relationship to the intersection. And of course, if this happens, if this is what ends up getting recommended, then I think at that point, the most acceptable place for a driveway would be right off of the intersection with the new cul-de-sac street for the Lake Forest condominium project, which is there to the north. So that's what that green arrow is there to represent. And also the applicant has volunteered to install some additional screening vegetation, probably not unlike the screening vegetation that would go along Lake Forest Drive for lots 20 and 21. So that would be along 27, probably in a similar vein to a previous image that I showed in my previous PowerPoint. So again, trying to help shield this dwelling unit's visibility from the primary thoroughfare, from a highway essentially, which is US 27, having it orient out onto Lake Forest Drive. But again, if an HOA is being entertained or eventually, becomes a part of the recommendation, then I think at that point it makes a lot of sense to have that be, dedicated open space that's maintained by the HOA, maybe having that as a gateway feature to the development right off of the main highway, and then moving lot 16 as sort of a panhandle style arrangement behind 15. Okay, and then the last topic that I wanted to touch on, which actually didn't get much discussion in February, but I believe does warrant at least some comment from staff, that is in regard to the maintenance of the retention ponds. So just to sort of recap what was in the staff report. So the applicant was proposing all the maintenance responsibilities to rest with the 2 private lot owners for each of the 2 new retention ponds that are being put in place to fulfill the city's stormwater management regulations. So these fall on lot 16 and lot 20. However, we do have code requirements in section 411 of the subdivision regulations for shared maintenance. So that could certainly take the form of an HOA. It could take the form of maybe something else. The applicant has mentioned ditch petitions as an example, which at least I believe they're only possible in unincorporated areas. That's where owners apparently pay into a fund of some kind that's kind of held there on reserve. And just in case there's something that goes wrong that needs to be corrected, the county engineer at that point can step in to resolve the matter. So there may be something along those lines that can be agreed to that helps to fulfill at least the code requirement in 411. But an HOA is still another possibility, another possible way of handling the maintenance responsibilities. So at this point, we have a recommended condition number 4. It's really in there as a reminder that section 411 needs to be complied with. It's really a subject that involves our service department a lot more than it does community development. So I have been in touch with the city engineer on this particular topic. He is okay, approves of the wording of condition 4. And the slightly revised wording in there is just to ensure that this is a responsibility that ultimately would rest with all residents of South Forest Edge, not just those of lots 16 and 20. And that concludes my brief, I guess, presentation. I'm happy to take any questions from the Planning Commission.
All right. As a matter of business, and if Mr. Connor wants to advise me against this, I'm okay with that. I believe we should have actually adjourned to public hearing, even to have Mr. Moore speak. So if that is something we should do as a formality, I'll do that. Otherwise, I'm okay letting the commission ask questions.
I think it's fine. It's a process issue. I mean, frankly, sometimes I think that sometimes commissions like to hear from the public and then they start to talk. So it's really up to the discretion right now. And it's a non-material oversight, if in fact it is an oversight.
All right. Well, I love that advice. So from here, if any of the commissioners have any questions for Mr. Moore, feel free. Mr. Dana.
I would like to refer us to the minutes of the previous session, and I have, I'm reading at pardon me, my error. I'm looking at the minutes here before our discussion, background, and potential subscreen. I'm looking at the previous page 010. What I'm looking at is my question revolves around the HOA. My question revolves around the power of who has the power to ultimately decide whether an HOA is installed, as it were, or as a part of a plan or who doesn't. And what I'm reading is Mr. Perry reminded the Planning Commission that this was within their purview to require an HOA or a buffer or a separate parcel, etc. So I guess what I'm a bit confused as to whether the power resides to the point that there can be no objection, or rather, is it the case that the developer says we can have all kinds of agreements and we can do that, but we're not going to have an HOA. I guess I'm just looking for some understanding as to what the power of the HOA is relative to the developer, relative to the Planning Commission, relative to the staff. I don't know if I've explained myself well enough, but that quote stuck out at me and I couldn't help but read it, because when the staff is referring to a purview to require an HOA, it seems to me quite significant. I don't know how else to put it. So I've tried to put a question, gnarled though it may be.
Mr. Moore, Mr. Perry, that is all yours to field.
I can take that one. So yeah, there was a lot there, Mr. Dana, but I appreciate you bringing it up and documenting what had been discussed previously. I think our primary concern has to do with, if there is something that is held in common or commonly benefiting all of the residents, that the maintenance or the management of that is distributed in common. So for example, the retention pond, whether it's a ditch petition or an HOA, I don't think it's material to us. It's just the fact that it would be that maintenance would be spread out so that it would not fall on the city to maintain that, because it is essentially private infrastructure benefiting the neighborhood. But as far as the screening or an HOA that might manage a separate parcel, yes, I think that's within your purview. I think another way to word that would be, can this be recommended for denial if there is not such features being done in a way that accomplishes the public interest or the public health, safety, and welfare? And the answer is yes. That's another way of saying that. And so I think, what you're doing right now is hearing from staff, hearing from the applicant, and sort of negotiating that out. And that's important for you all to let them know where you stand on those various issues so that they can respond accordingly. So hopefully that's helpful. And the answer is, in the short, yes, it is within your purview.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Dr. Perfthurch.
Can I just ask a follow-up question for that? Because the question of the HOA then relates to a number of other conditions. If there's an HOA, then those other conditions, would that other arrangement other than an HOA be able to do the same things, or is an HOA the only mechanism? So
yeah, if it's an equivalent type of arrangement, staff is satisfied with that, realizing that this is preliminary, and we can work those details out. But if there's unwillingness, or if the applicant is saying that, we can't comply with that condition needs to be removed, that's a big problem. So yes, we will accept and review and work with the applicant on an alternative that's not an HOA, but effectively the same as distributing that. So thank you.
Mr. Bracken.
Yes, I was just wondering if there's any incompatibility with addressing the first issue of creating sort of the stub road that doesn't fully go out, and how we have to rearrange the plots from that. And the second issue of trying to make a 40-foot easement or other such easement.
Great question. I think I'm going to go ahead and pull up my exhibit one more time to speak from that. So we go back to, okay, I think this would probably be the best one to speak from. So if you can recall, so the stub would be roughly in this location here. So I think at that point, there would be front yards. This would all be front yards along here, which would be exempt areas. So there would be a sliver of green area that would be taken out as a result of that. However, of course, the green area that would fall within the right of way, since there wouldn't be a street being built in that location, then you could leave the trees in place there. That would achieve the same effect that the conservation area restriction would on the private lots that would be to the north. But there would be a little section here that would probably have to be removed because it would become side yard instead of rear.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Keebler.
Zach, could you bring that plan back up again a minute? I was a little surprised that this subject came back, a potential substreet, because I thought we were pretty much all in agreement that a good place for a potential stub street in this development was up at the east end. And I think we've got a little bit of a problem with what we're calling east, north, or whatever. But I think that the far end up here, behind lot number 1, would really be an ideal place to put in a street. It would connect directly to Lake Forest, as opposed to having to be a burden of the smaller streets within the subdivision, and could field any number of development further on. If you look at page 92 from last week's packet, 93 of last week's packet, you see Woodruff Road coming in there. And so if there's ever going to be a continuation of development, I don't think it belongs out of a 16-lot subdivision. It belongs out of the greater road, which is Lake Forest Drive. And I thought that's what we had pretty much agreed upon at the last meeting. It's not part of this development, but the same developer owns the next property. And it's a lot longer than what this subdivision is, as far as the distance along Lake Forest Drive. And to me, that's where the stub street belongs, and the right-of-way belongs, as a connection over to some future development, should it ever occur, and not in the middle of this subdivision. And I thought we'd pretty much agreed upon that. So Zach, I don't understand why you brought it back up again. Okay, I think this is staff and not what we talked about. And I don't think it makes any sense. Now, if you wanted to put an easement for a walking connection or bike connection that might go into a back of another subdivision, something like up at the end of Hunter Woods, connects into the city park, fine. But this is not the place for a street. It just doesn't make sense to me. And again, I thought we'd all agreed upon that at the last meeting.
Mr. Moore, you're welcome to respond. Mr. Perry, I don't recall who had spoken to that earlier or at the previous meeting.
Mr. Chair, I might say that in a typical situation, we would let the applicant, after sort of some basic questions, we would let the applicant kind of give their update. I mean, we can continue to have some kind of back and forth, but going back to the normal way we would do it, if maybe you want to open it up to the applicant, it's up to you.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. Thank you. I appreciate you doing that because I can only see 5 people when you're sharing the screen. I checked the minutes and I do recall us discussing the stub street, but I don't recall per se what was just mentioned. So maybe it would help, Ms. Reed, if you would like to share any of the updates or maybe a brief recap of some of the key points that you shared with us last month. I would greatly appreciate that.
Sure, not a problem. Good evening. My name is Etta Reed with Bear Becker, 110 South College Avenue, Oxford, Ohio. and I'm here tonight on behalf of Four Leaf Development requesting your recommendation of approval for the preliminary plat for South Forest Edge. As presented at the last Planning Commission meeting, Four Leaf Development is proposing a by right subdivision consisting of 21 single-family residential lots which exceed the minimum lot dimensional requirements of the R2A zoning district and is significantly under the maximum number of lots permitted by right for this property. This was their choice, as they desire to develop residential lots which are currently not available in the city of Oxford. That is 20,000 square foot minimum lots, which are predominantly wooded. During the previous Planning Commission meeting and follow-up discussions with staff, it has become our understanding that this is not being recognized as a by right development and is being held to more stringent standards similar to a planned unit development. We ask, what is the benefit of developing a by right subdivision over a PUD if we are going to have additional subjective requirements imposed on us? We have had an opportunity to review staff's latest memo and offer up the following. By right, Four Leaf could develop 109 single-family residential lots on this piece of property. The request before you tonight is for the approval to construct 21 lots, or less than 20% of the allowable permitted density for this parcel. For this voluntary reduction in density, we are being asked to do the following. 1, provide a public street to the east to property located outside the city limits, which does not have public sewer, and more importantly, the adjacent property owners have indicated they do not want a stub to them. Staff has offered up 3 options to address this matter. 1, a partial street stub and paper street. While this is staff's preferred option, we are opposed to this option for the following reasons. As mentioned, this will be a street stub to an adjacent parcel outside the city limits, which does not have access to public sewer. Therefore, the likelihood for future development is not there. Secondly, it will require the elimination of trees unnecessarily for the construction of both the street stub and the temporary turnaround, which is totally contradictory to the concern of preserving trees on the individual lots. It will be an additional cost to the development, which provides absolutely no benefit to our future residents. Additionally, the stub street will become the maintenance responsibility and a liability for the city. We would ask, is it a responsible action to encumber the city with these expenses and liability for a street which will never be extended? Lastly, and more importantly, the adjacent property owners have testified at the last meeting that they do not want the street stub to their property. The second option offered by staff is a paper street only, wherein we would dedicate the right-of-way and the right-of-way would become the responsibility of the city. Again, we would ask, is it a responsible action to encumber the city with this responsibility and liability for the maintenance of a future street and a property that may never be, for a street that may never be constructed? And lastly, the third option is no paper street or no stub. Four Leaf is agreeable to this option. The second option being asked of Four Leaf is to encumber 15 lots with a conservation tree preservation easement, which will limit what the future homeowner can do on their property. The original staff report provided 4 options to achieve compliance with the tree preservation ordinance, of which staff recommended the option to defer the tree survey to the building permit stage. As I presented at the last meeting, we agreed with staff's recommendation to defer the tree survey to the building permit stage. And as discussed, we envision these homes and the lots, the placement of the home on the lot will be determined by the builder and the homeowner as they work together to site the home on the lot to maximize the view, privacy, and more importantly, the protection of specific trees to set that perfect setting for the homeowner. It was our understanding that by agreeing with this option, we would be in compliance with the tree preservation ordinance. Based upon the testimony we heard of the adjacent property owners to the east, we understand that Planning Commission wishes to require that a buffer be provided along our east boundary line. This is an extremely subjective requirement as a buffer between R2A and agricultural zone land is not required by your zoning code. In the previous meetings, we were not agreeable to your request for a conservation easement along the east property line. We have reconsidered and would be agreeable to placing a 30-foot conservation easement along the east or rear property line of lots 2 through 11 only to address this buffer concern. The adjacent properties to the east currently have a vegetated buffer of approximately 30 to 50 feet on their property. Assuming they retain their buffer, this will provide Mr. Schulte and Ms. Berger with a buffer in excess of 60 feet. As staff has indicated, the conservation easement would restrict the construction of improvements within the easement, but it would allow the removal of vegetation under 10 inches in diameter. We are not agreeable to placing a conservation easement on the north side of lots 1 and 2, or along the south side of lots 11 through 15 as proposed by staff in the recent memo. We would contend that the combination of the conservation easement along the east boundary line and the tree survey at the time of the building permit application exceeds the requirements of the tree preservation ordinance. Thirdly, Four Leaf is being asked to construct a landscape buffer along Lake Forest Drive to screen the rear yards of lots 17 through 21. As I have presented in the last meeting, street trees will be provided along Lake Forest Drive, which will provide a visual screen for the users of Lake Forest Drive into the rear yards of these homes. Additionally, Section 410B of the subdivision regulations reads as follows. Every subdivider shall provide sufficient buffering or additional lot depth when topographical or other barriers do not provide reasonable screening, and when Planning Commission determines that there is a need to shield the development from the negative impacts of adjacent uses, such as streets or railroads. The proposed lot configuration meets the intent of the code. For R2A zoning, the required minimum lot depth would be 100 feet. Lot 20 is over 219 feet deep, or over double the underlying zoning requirement. We contend that we have met the intent of this requirement by providing additional lot depth and street trees to buffer the future homeowners from Lake Forest Drive. Next, Four Leaf has been asked to eliminate Lot 16 or place it behind Lot 15 on the basis that Lot 16 feels detached from the rest of the lots and is the entry to the development. Again, this is a very subjective restriction. Lot 16 is an exceptional 2.17 acre lot, which exceeds the lot size requirements of R2A and meets all the setback requirements. By placing Lot 16 behind Lot 15, we would be negatively impacting the privacy of both those lots. As staff has indicated, Four Leaf is agreeable to supplementing the existing vegetation along 27 to provide a buffer for the home, and we are agreeable to increasing the front yard setback to 100 feet off the center line of both US 27 and Lake Forest Drive to match the setback for the existing homes on US 27. And lastly, provide proof of an adequate funding stream for the maintenance of the retention basins. We agree that the maintenance of the basins are important. However, once construction, the maintenance of a retention basin is minimal and essentially entails keeping the outlet structure free of debris. The retention basins are an amenity to these lots, which the homeowner will want to maintain and enjoy. By requiring the other residents of the subdivision to contribute financially to the maintenance of the retention basin, you imply that they are able to use and enjoy the amenity, when in reality it is on a private individual's property and not for everyone in the development to use. We propose to provide a covenant and restriction on the record plat, which indicates that the owners of lots 16 and 21 are responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the retention basins in accordance with the city's ordinance, and that any modifications to the basins will require the approval of the city engineer. This will be on the record plat and disclosed with the sale of these lots. In closing, we have heard your concerns and hope you agree that we have made some concessions, which will indeed make South Forest Edge even better. We ask that you forward a recommendation of approval to City Council tonight with the changes we have requested. Thank you.
Mr. Connard?
I apologize. I have a hard stop at 8:05 and Mr. Mazur's on the call or on the Zoom, and he will be taking over. As it relates to the issue of the covenant that Ms. Reed just raised, on behalf of the law director, I take no position one way or another on that point. However, if the decision were to be made that the covenant that's proposed was acceptable, obviously that would need to be reviewed by the legal department before anything were recorded. And that would be true of anything related to ultimately the retention of the pond or anything that would be, and I'm not using this word in the legal sense, but something that would be a common responsibility.
Thank you, sir. All right, Dr. Prithridge, did you have a question?
No, are we at into discussion or what's the questions from Ms. Reed or?
We can do questions for Ms. Reed, and then I did ask Mr. Perry, because this had come back up after we have questions for Ms. Reed. I do want to see if there is additional comment from the public, simply because this was publicized as a continuation. So if you have questions for Ms. Reed, I'll entertain those. I do not see any. Mr. Perry, do you see any indication that there is public comment on this item?
We've got a couple attendees. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. I don't know if you want to give a minute or two, or, okay, there's a
Yeah.
hand up now.
All right, Mr. Perry, you are in control of this part. Please recognize the person. And once you're recognized by Mr. Perry, please state your name and your address for the record, and your comments, please keep them to approximately 3 minutes or less.
All right, Jacob Schulte, you're on.
Hello, good evening. My name is Jacob Schulte, and I live at 3898 Woodruff Road, Oxford, Ohio, 45056. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank both the staff and the council for taking the community's concerns and the community's interests into consideration and making some accommodations and stuff that would probably be some of the best solutions that would appease both our interests and as well as the future community. Just to kind of recap on this natural buffer that we are interested in on the eastern and to an extent southern border, this natural buffer, it would serve a very similar purpose for privacy and environmental concerns as the buffer along those center lots along Lake Forest Drive. You know, the trees are going to help, and the natural vegetation will help create privacy for the homeowners from people living on or traveling Woodruff Road. So, you know, and we would really like to see some addition that privacy concern and the, you know, preservation of natural resources. On the remarks about our own personal buffer zone that we had between, I think it was stated 50 to 60 feet of trees on our own property, that isn't exactly correct. There are some small areas where we do have trees along both the ditchway and some property boundaries. But for the most part, a lot of that border is mowed and maintained directly up to the property line. Within maybe 5 feet, there's a few trees along 5 feet there, but for the most part, you know, it's grass and it is mowed and maintained. It's for crop production, all the way up to the property line. So we have, you know, we have crops and there's a small grass way, but it's all the way up to the property line. So, and it's been that way for several years. So, but yeah, like I said, thank you for taking our consideration and interest. So.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Perry, do we have any other comments that you see?
No, sir, not at this time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, at this point, as I said, being old business and a continuation of our previous discussion, if there's no questions for Ms. Reed, I will take us back into discussion of the commission. The only comment I have, and I just wanted to say, and this is more for the record and for the commission to consider, is on the comment of staff recommendation. I just wanted to clarify that staff recommendation is not binding to the commission. It is a recommendation that needs to be considered. So I just wanted to bring clarity to that that staff and our legal counsel offers us guidance and advice, staff offers us direction and options, and ultimately the commission is responsible for their votes collectively and individually. So I just wanted to clarify that so that there was no misconception either by the public or anyone in the commission of obligation to suggested options. That being said, Dr. Prithridge, then Mr. Keebler.
So we can get into the meat of it. I just wanted to, just in response to Ms. Reed's comment, kind of likening this to a PUD process. Clearly there's a dialogue back and forth, but ultimately the Planning Commission has to decide whether the subdivision as proposed can meet the standards set out in the code. And if it does, including through conditions, then it can improve them. If, for example, the subdivision as proposed doesn't meet the standards of the code, it's a by right subdivision, but that doesn't mean this subdivision is by right to be approved. It has to meet our code. And so that's the kind of choice we have to make, whether the applicant wishes to go with the staff conditions or not, or our conditions. It's really our discussion as to what conditions would make this acceptable within the limits of the code in order for us to approve it. And so then it could become a choice. If those conditions are unacceptable, we can deny it also. So it's a little bit different from a PUD, but that doesn't mean that conditions can't be made in order for us to get to yes or not. So.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Keebler.
I think what David said is true, but at the same time, I think we have to look at alternatives. I mean, they can put 10 times as many houses in there as they're proposing. Then what would that do for you? They can do it by right. We can force a stub street, but other than that, they've met every other requirement. Okay, so how far do you try and take it? We're down to 16 lots, and I can't remember exactly what Ed has said they're allowed, but it's 10 times that amount within that property. Now, that's kind of a fallacy because the topography won't let it happen. But we created a tree ordinance, and now you want more. Okay, so a 30-foot buffer, which they're agreeing to, which they don't have to, sounds like a pretty good compromise to me. And just because it's 30 feet doesn't mean that every property owner is going to cut down the rest of the trees that aren't the 30-foot buffer, because our tree ordinance doesn't allow that unless it's required to be able to build the building. And with the setbacks and stuff, that's highly unlikely that's going to occur. Nobody wants to pay big money for a wooded lot and clear cut it. And so then give them a 30-foot easement. To me, 40 foot's arbitrary. 30 foot's arbitrary, but they've agreed to it. Okay, they've agreed to further setbacks on lot 16. I wouldn't buy that lot, but that doesn't mean somebody won't. Okay, but these are lots that people want, and as Zach started out right to begin with in the presentation last time, that this area is designed for typical neighborhood development as part of our current comprehensive plan. And that's what they've given us. And they've given you a lot of land, a lot of open space. And it's a by right. And I don't see anything in there that they haven't complied with except the stub street. And to me, the stub street within the confines of this little place doesn't make any sense. Like I said, I think it belongs between this one and the next one. And it's the same owner. And I think, and I'm sure Miss Reed will be involved in that. So when she starts laying it out, she better consider that to come back again. Okay, that at some point there definitely needs to be a connector planned from Lake Forest Drive to that vacant land. Because if we don't, we're making a mistake, folks. But I don't think it belongs in this. And I think you need to approve it with the things that is agreed to. Now, I do think you have to be careful about the retention ponds, because you don't want the city to have to take them over. And so if you can do that in the covenant, that you can require the property owner to do it, and the property owner is willing to buy that, maybe that's fine. I can't answer that. But I think if you're going to make it an HOA, they're going to have to make it public land. And I don't know how that's been handled in previous subdivisions. But again, folks, look at the alternative. Look at what they could be shoving at us, you know, and what could happen. I think they've come to you with a pretty darn nice plan. And my guess is the people that have that lot 20 and 21 or whatever it is, they're going to want to put a buffer in there. They're not going to want the backs of their houses or sides of their houses fully exposed to Lake Forest Drive. So I think we need to approve it with the things that the developer has agreed to.
Thank you, Mr. Keebler. Mr. Dana?
I would just like to request that that Zach repeat what he said with regard to a 40-foot buffer as to a 30-foot, and why one was preferable, and it had to do with specific trees. But I'm just yearning to remember what he said there, so that I could discern, arbitrary though they may be, one, according to staff, is considerably better than the other. That's what I'm trying to understand. If you would be kind enough to replay that, as it were.
Mr. Moore?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dana, for that question. I'm happy to elaborate on the reason for the 40 feet. So the reason why we're recommending the 40, we are looking to the tree exhibit that was provided for lot 9 as a sample. So the building pad location and potential patio location was giving us sort of a sample of a way in which a lot could be developed. As Ms. Reed has alluded to, ultimately it would be the decision of the buyer and the builder to, negotiate in terms of where the building footprint ends up going and where any accessory uses in the backyard end up getting placed. But just going off of that sample plot plan that was provided to us, essentially it was the lots that are standard in size that are along the eastern edge, that have their rear yards abutting that eastern edge, that are there along the street that's oriented north-south, Arbor Edge Trail. Those are 200 feet in depth, give or take a foot or two, I believe. But just going off that 200 feet of depth, what they were showing was 120 feet of developed space that would be exempted by the tree ordinance. So that leaves the 80 feet in the rear that is not exempt. So what the tree ordinance provides for is the ability to put in place an easement or conservation area restriction, what I might also refer to as a deed restriction, a set of covenants that goes on the plat that basically prohibits certain things from being done within that area. It prevents the clear cutting of vegetation within that area. If the applicant was showing that at that 80-foot distance, I think at that point, that would be the one and only thing that fulfills the tree ordinance requirements. At that point, they've demonstrated that per this, sample layout of where a home would go, where other backyard features would go, this would be the area that would be remaining that would not be exempt. And if that area is protected, then the tree ordinance is fulfilled. I don't think we can get to that point, or at least the applicant isn't agreeable to that, because they would prefer to have a larger swath of area in those rear yards be available for development of other uses, whether they be sheds or pools or decks or whatnot, and not have that restriction put in place for that wide of an area. So the 40 feet was based on just taking that 80 feet right down the middle. So taking the 80 divided by 2, 40 feet goes to the owner, 40 feet goes to the conservation area. And then also looking to that sample tree exhibit and just noticing how many more trees got included just by adding the additional 10 feet. Those were the reasons why we felt that 40 feet was a good distance to set it at.
All right.
The 30 feet, will help get us there. It may not get us all the way to what we would recommend be, option A, but part of this discussion is that a lot of these things are very malleable in terms of, the discussion and so forth with the commission. So we tried to present the best recommendation that we could given all of the circumstances.
Thank you. That's very thorough. I have just quickly one further question for you, I believe, and Mr. Perry perhaps, and that has to do with the location of the stub street. Because I was a little bit taken aback when Mr. Kubler said, I don't understand why we're talking about a stub street where you, the staff, is requiring it. It should be in another place. And that really throws me a little bit. I wonder if there's any commentary that you would advance on that point.
Yeah, I don't recall the specific point that Mr. Keebler raised about the street connection to the north. If that was said in discussion, I apologize if I missed that. But I think there is an interesting point there that maybe the stub street location would make more sense if it was further north off that northern knuckle versus off the southern knuckle. But the reason why, at least from staff's viewpoint, why we wanted to present a little bit more information with that is the previous discussion, there wasn't, at least the idea of, building the stub 2/3 the way to the line. I think at that point, the discussion, at least what was implied from that, was that the street would be all the way built to the edge and it would be removing sort of that tree buffer that's already there along that edge. So we wanted to present an alternative that could maybe balance the interest of connectivity with the interest of preserving, a sufficient vegetated buffer, at least in the interim, or I'll call it the short term. But until such point, when that area, the farm field to the east, if it should ever develop, there would be a vegetated buffer there, but also the ability to connect a future street.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Bracken.
And I was just going to confirm that even if we did the stub street, that would still be below the minimum. And so we would even need a waiver to allow that to begin with, right? So it's not like we're not giving any leeway here. We'd still be granting leeway even with the stub street.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Prithridge.
Just to keep us from not bouncing all over the place, would it make sense that we focused our conversation on the proposed kind of alternative conditions that Mr. Moore has laid out? I mean, he's put a lot of, I love that the definition of planning is assisting decision makers. He's given us, there's the existing conditions, there's alternative A, B, and sometimes C. So maybe that would help us kind of focus. But if we did that, can maybe we start with the last one, because I think resolving the question of whether there's an HOA bears on some of the other conditions. So yeah, that's just a thought for because I have thoughts on all these things, but maybe if we can deal with them in turn, that will focus us.
Absolutely. And I agree with your reverse order if there's no objection to that. So Mr. Moore, if you would put the slide back up. It looks like we're going to start with 5. Dr. Prithridge has a really good point. There are some things that would be impacted depending on what direction this goes. Thank you, sir.
Would you like me to navigate to?
It would have been the 5th of the 5 you do, which would have been the maintenance of the retention ponds, is what I have.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so,
And if I could just build on, why I want to come to this is because I'll say it for the record, it's crazy talk to imagine private maintenance of these facilities. I think our code envisions that publicly shared facilities need to be maintained by some kind of entity. And so I think there can be a variety of ways of how to do that, but our code talks about how open spaces are maintained, whether it's an HOA, condominium association, whether there's an open space management entity. It just has to be one of those. And to me, that's just kind of like for me, it's a no-brainer. And if we can agree on that, then we can think about that as being an entity that could help with some of the other conditions.
no, I agree, because that also, to an extent, would have to do with the screening, because, it's more of a pre-agreement as opposed to relying on folks who get the land. So what are the thoughts of fellow commissioners?
Well, I think that David, if I may, it's Steve Dana here. I think that David has hit on exactly the right point, is that we need to resolve the issue of maintenance and responsibility and accounting for same. We have to come to a conclusion regarding that in this issue of the retention ponds in order to be able to deal constructively with those other issues where an HOA comes into possible play but is rejected. Does that make sense?
Yes. Mr. Mazur, is there any benefit, and I apologize for putting you on the spot. You can thank Mr. Conard for that. Is there any benefit or advice that we as the commission should know of the difference or treatment of an HOA versus covenants on the property? Is there any benefit to either or any bearing on our conversation that comes to mind?
Mr. Chair, really, certainly the HOA could be identified as one of the acceptable options pursuant to Section 411 in the covenant, of course. So that's certainly one option that the Planning Commission could choose to impose as a condition. Whether there's any benefit opting to go with a HOA as opposed to another entity or other trust to handle the management of the retention pond, not necessarily. I think there's certainly HOAs are certainly unique in their own right, but there's really no benefit there with respect to what tool Planning Commission would recommend to satisfy Section 411. But certainly, as we agree, or at least as both staff and the law director agrees, Section 411 does require that something be chosen and addressed in the restrictive covenants that would allow for the management of that retention pond. I'm sorry for the long answer, but hopefully that's somewhat instructive.
No, perfect. Thank you. Mr. Perry?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben, and for the question. I think that we should probably just look around town and see what some examples are. South Farm was a recent case, and there's an active HOA. You can see they have a nicely managed pond there in front of Cobblestone Church. Northridge, that they don't have an active HOA. It's a single lot that owns a pond, not maintained as well. Walmart, you're all familiar with. There's a retention pond there. Different situation, not residential, but there you have a significant entity. So I think, we can talk about the instruments, we can talk about the mechanisms, but I think the practical reality is, having one homeowner or two homeowners to be responsible for that adds a layer of risk. That is the whole reason why the code says that's not what is allowed. So, the fact that we're talking about this, this is a condition we've put in there more as a reminder of something that's already required by the code. So council really can't approve that if that's not provided anyway. So I'm not sure that's the best use of time if the applicant is saying they're absolutely not going to do it, then, that's a big problem. So I'm not sure what else you can really do.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Ms. Reed, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we are, as I've indicated, we really want the homeowners to take care of it because it's on their property. We are opposed to an HOA, but we are willing to talk with staff and your law director to maybe there's another assessment, another way to meet your desires while meeting our desires at the same time. So if we could leave the condition such that we would, basically work with the service department and law director to come up with a amenable solution that would be agreeable to us rather than automatically requiring us to have an HOA.
Dr. Prithridge, I see you nodding. So
I mean, this condition 4 as stated kind of envisioned that, right, Mr. Perry? So the mechanism is to be determined, but this ensures there will be a mechanism, and I'm okay with that.
Can't you add to that condition to meet the requirements of section 411 of the Oxford City Code? And then it's very clear that they've got to come up with some kind of an agreement that does that.
Well, I agree, Mr. Keebler, I agree, but I just think it's worth repeating that section makes it mandatory. One can go and talk with them and approach them and talk with them, but eventually there has to be a decision, and the code has said what that decision has to be.
all right. From the nods and facial expressions, I think that is pretty well addressed. Seeing as there's no other logical order, I will just go with lot 16. And I'm basing this off, I know there are conditions and recommendations in our packet, but for ease of discussion, I'm going off the 5 that Mr. Moore presented because those were clarifying moments, if that's all right with folks. And then we can definitely address anything that's not addressed for folks. So the lot 16, the 100-foot setbacks, it sounds as though Miss Reed is fairly agreeable to what Mr. Moore has presented. Are there any concerns, observations, or questions that folks have on lot 16, which would be, I affectionately called it the gateway, because it is the corner, and as Mr. Keebler said, he wouldn't buy that lot. So are there any other observations or questions? Does the commission, are you comfortable with what Mr. Moore has presented and what Ms. Reed has said that the developer is agreeable to? Dr. Prithridge?
Personal preference for option B, but that's just me. I think that it could resolve some of the traffic issues. I think it will make the layout better from a visual point of view. I think we have to imagine that there's going to be some deceleration. People are going to come off of 27 at 55 and turn on to that. And the idea of a driveway being almost immediately there, so it's not just about the setback to me, it's about the vehicular access. And I would just prefer that driveway not be off of Lake Forest Drive. And if there's an HOA to maintain that open space, that's my preference. But
Speed limit's only 45, David.
is it only? Yeah. Ribbon it, right?
So thank you for confessing on public record that you speed.
All right.
All right. So I'm not seeing any disagreement discussion. Dr. Prithridge's comments, the 100-foot setback, I think, does to an extent achieve what we were looking for is the backing off of that intersection. And again, I'm looking at all visible faces, so without seeing anything, I'm going to move us forward. The next one is that I believe Mr. Moore brought up would be the Lake Forest Drive screening. Mr. Moore presented that. Ms. Reed had addressed, thank you. And I do appreciate, Mr. Moore, you going to where I'm going because I have no control over what we look at. Are there any questions, comments, concerns on the screening? Ms. Reed has said that the design of the lots does allow for the additional space, which is a natural buffer. And Mr. Keebler pointed out that people will logically and naturally probably plant things once they get some headlights in their back deck.
I think it's a suitable resolution. So I think it makes sense, what's been presented.
Okay. I am going to go out of order, and I'm sure you guys will appreciate it afterwards. I'm going to skip the 30 versus 40 foot buffer, and I'm going to go to the stub road because I think we can solve that one quicker. So on the stub road, we have a couple different options, different ideas. Just to synthesize, Mr. Bracken pointed out that one stub is a waiver from the compliance of what I believe should be two stubs. I see you, Ms. Rosenberg. I will call on you in a hot second. There are options of no stub, a modified stub, a paper stub. So there are different ones. We don't have to talk through all of them, but definitely I would like to know everyone's take after Ms. Rosenberg shares her thoughts.
So as I expressed at the last meeting, I am not in favor of a stub road. Oh, you get to hear my dog. Fantastic. So I'm not in favor of a stub road. I understand that it is in the code. I understand that connectivity is very important. However, this seems like a pretty specific kind of neighborhood, and it is also in a very specific geographic location. So I just like to think about those kinds of things. The comparison that I see is like with Stone Creek Drive on the other side of town. I mean, let's face it, that is a super high price neighborhood that is a circle that allows access to emergency vehicles. It's at the edge of town. And I really want to respect the township and the neighbors on that side. Even having a right of way that goes through the lots there in that neighborhood seems to me kind of excessive for a neighborhood that I just don't see as really going anywhere, even once there may be development 40 years from now on that side. I can't see that this neighborhood is going to want to be like, I know I'm sounding very, very like layman about this, but it's at the edge of town, and it is a well-to-do neighborhood that is being proposed here. I just don't see that as long as emergency vehicles have access to everything, that we need to have every single thing connected to each other. I see so much potential for development as infill. We have so much land in the city limits, which I would love to see, densely populated by all sorts of affordable housing and connectivity. This neighborhood is just not that.
All right, Mr. Bracken.
I understand that, but as I see it, the property adjacent looks similar to the current property that wouldn't have looked like it would be developed. And that looks like the adjacent property that didn't look like it would be developed eventually. And also because it would be agricultural land that might be developed, that's actually preferable to taking down forest, which is what we're doing here right now. 90% of the land that we're taking now is forest. So I worry that sometime in the future it could be connected, and it would be better to do it now because, as mentioned, I think you wouldn't be able to do it otherwise.
So Mr. Dana, Mr. Keebler, and then I have a comment, if that's okay. So Mr. Dana.
I simply want to endorse what Mr. Bracken has said, and I think his understanding of what the future may hold is very apt. It is replicable in many communities, and I am in favor of the points that Mr. Bracken made. End of matter.
All right. Mr. Keebler first, and then I will yield my turn to Ms. Rosenberg.
I do believe connectivity is important. And I believe that this land, though, should be looked at not as just this particular subdivision, but should be looked at as the whole property. And I don't think that the connectivity point that's being proposed within this area is the right place for it. It should be just north of that, between it and whatever's developed next, not within this subdivision.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rosenberg, I will let you take my turn and then I have a comment. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So I first of all want to agree completely with Mr. Keebler on what he just said. You know, when I say that there shouldn't be connectivity in this neighborhood is also connected to a wonderful new street, Lake Forest Drive, which has plenty of potential to have streets developed off of it as we develop more land. So I know I'm not expressing myself in the best way possible, but you can consider me to be in agreement with Mr. Keebler here, who has expressed it much better.
All right. Just a couple quick bullet points I wanted to share. I was on the Planning Commission when we had the luxury of discussing Westgate Drive and some perceived views that Westgate would somehow blaze through personal property on the way up to Do4 Lane. So I agree with the observations that if you go back 40 years, even 20 years, the footprint of the city limits, things of that nature are far different than they are now. So I say that more as a reminder warning that we can't, well, we can. It's a heck of a lot harder to tear down a house and put a street through than it is to measure twice and cut once. Now, that being said, two things. I agree with Ms. Rosenberg and Mr. Keebler because I live on Emerald Woods, and guess what? The diagonal road through town is a cut through. So I can understand where even if it's 40 years down the road, this may not be the appropriate place to put a stub road through. So if we were going to do it, I think Mr. Keebler had a really interesting observation that you know, completely outside of residential and having something more similar to, for lack of a word, a trunk road or a specific through road connected to Lake Forest makes more sense. I do agree completely with that. Now, that being said, my 2B, I personally would be willing to forego all stub roads because I am far more concerned about the 30-40 foot buffer. And I think Ms. Reed brought up a very good point that if we're going to have a stub road, even if it's a 2/3 turnaround, that's somewhat contrary to preserving the trees that are important in this buffer. So there's my 3 points. Take them for what they will. Dr. Prithridge, then Mr. Bracken.
So first, just a substantive thing. I think that one of the things we need to remember is that these points of connectivity don't just serve cars. You know, so imagining moving a connection half a mile further north, because that's where you'd want to drive. I mean, Mr. Keebler can mention his own neighborhood. I mean, a kid who lives in his neighborhood who wants to go to the community park has to trespass through another person's property to get there. Kids do that all the time. But so to me, I think there's a middle ground between blazing the road through and maintaining a public right of way that could be maintained in trees for X amount of years. B, it can be traversed so the neighbors can walk to each other's houses, and C, it's there in the future when you need it. And I think that, so this comes back to my procedural point, which is that, you know, I really want to do a big shout out to the community development staff and Zach for providing us options, concrete options to choose between. And so I'm just thinking about, for example, how do we, for example, pick between them? He's given us 3 options here. Like, do we just want to do straw poll, or do we want to people make motions? And then, because I get like looking around the room and whether people are nodding or smiling, but it might be nice to have a sense on a divided question like this, like which one moves forward. So thoughts, Mr. Perry Moore or Mazer, on how we might like democratically move through options?
Well, I will take care of that, but I also wanted to hear what people had to say before, because I don't want to entertain an option on number one and have a commissioner not get the chance to speak on other options. So
no, that's okay. I just wanted to know, like, so when we get to those places where it's kind of confusing, and for this one, I mean, I like option A. I don't know why it's not the knuckle to the north. Like that made a little bit more sense to me, but maybe it's topography. To me, it's at absolute minimum. You have a paper street, but I think a paper street plus some degree of improvement. And I think what A is a really reasonable solution, but I think B is the minimum. So that's just my impressions.
But David, couldn't it be not a street? But you talked about not being just cars.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. It would be nice if in my subdivision there were a connection to the community park. But I think that's what was envisioned the last time we redid the subdivision ordinance, was it didn't have to be for cars. It could be for a walkway. So why not an easement at some place to be worked out between staff and the developer, an easement that would provide a connectivity through there, should there ever be an opportunity to connect to something next to it, as opposed to a street.
Mr. Dana?
I want to just, in a way, almost thank Mr. Keebler, because I see the logic of what he is saying. I see the logic of what Ms. Rosenberg is saying. I guess I just feel that what Dr. Pritchard has proposed, the idea of an easement and applicability to people other than in cars, all of that provides the kinds of solutions that could be workable. So I'm expressing myself that way. Thank you.
I mean, it could be modeled off what was done at Hunter Woods.
Mr. Bracken?
I just wanted to go back to your comment and Ed's comment, Ms. Reed, about losing the trees in the right of way there. I don't think that would be a significant amount. And likely if we were to connect it in the north, it would actually be more likely to take out many more trees. So I don't think that's much of a point in favor of not making it there.
Okay. So I think for the sake of time, I think we've shared our perspective and our comment. It'd probably be most appropriate for whoever makes the motion to capture and present theirs. And then if there's disagreement or folks feel strongly that the motion didn't capture where they would like it to go, they are welcome to offer amendments, friendly or formal. The last topic that Mr. Moore presented on that would be germane and not different would be the condition where they proposed a 40-foot setback. Ms. Reed had said that they were okay with a 30-foot setback for lots 2 through 11, but not okay in lots 1 and 2. And I do need clarification. I had written down lots 11 through 15. Mr. Moore, could you actually punch up the map that you had shown? Sorry, I should have given you fair warning on that one. And there we go. So this is a reduction. And Mr. Moore, is this based off our, not that the lines would be horribly different for our eyes on this, but the green line is slightly inside the dotted line. So that does represent 40 feet. Is that correct?
Yeah, from the, excuse me, from the eastern line, it's 40 feet. From the southern line, it's 40 feet. And from the northern line, it's 80 feet as shown here.
Okay.
And the conditions that are drafted in the memo reflect what's shown on this map.
And I just realized not lot 11 is the one with a corner, so that makes sense why Miss Reed said not the southern with 11. So 11 is Yes, thank you. She had said they are agreeable to the east on the right going vertically, but not the portion at the bottom of our screens going horizontally. I personally would like the 40-foot. I know it's just 10 feet, but at the same time, I also think Mr. Moore's observation of, 10 feet could capture, 2 trees hypothetically per lot. And as I said earlier, I'm less concerned with some of the other areas and the leeway there with the screening and access and lot 16. Are there any questions, comments? Do people have a problem with the 40? All right, Mr. Bracken, then Dr. Prithridge. It's amazing how I see everybody when you go back to that.
I was just going to say that I'm in agreement with you, Mr. Watt. I think the 40 is important, and I think it's more important than the screening. And I think there's a big difference, not just in the trees that we might get, as pointed out by Mr. Moore, but also because I know about forest connectivity and the amount of canopy lost in just 10 feet when it connects to the other 30 feet. So I'm very much for that whenever possible.
Mr. Bracken, quick clarification. Do you have any objections? Ms. Reed had mentioned the north and the south. Do you have any preference of or lack of concern, for no other way to put it, with the north or the south?
I would prefer to keep as much as we can. I can understand, especially on the corner lots, that might not be a viable option. And so that totally makes sense for an exception.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify. Dr. Prithridge?
So I was thinking about how this is called arbor's edge, which implies that the trees would be at the edge of the forest, which I believe our code, our code talks a lot about trees, even absent a tree ordinance, and about mitigating, and in the hopes that we don't just punch the roads and the lots into the forest, but we balance and mitigate. And I do think that kicking the can down the road at the permit, building permit stage to do the tree survey is just not realistic. It creates a lot of extra work for staff. It's just, I think there needs to be a resolution at the front end. And to me, that resolution is the difference between me being able to vote for this thing or not, because this thing is already teetering on the edge of not really fulfilling the conditions of our subdivision ordinance. And if we're not trying to balance and sensitive, and we're not able to do that adequately, then I don't feel like it fulfills our ordinance, and I feel like I might have to vote against it. So this is my comfort zone, which is, one could talk about arbitrary boundaries, but unless I'm mistaken, the width of the right-of-way of Arbor Ridge Road or whatever is 60 feet, right? Is that right, Mr. Moore? Is the local street 60 feet, or Etta? So we have a street that's completely exempted from our tree ordinance that will basically be raised. To me, I think that it's a reasonable mitigation to have a 60-foot boundary around the edge. If you've ever measured 10 feet in a forest, it's not very much. 20 feet is not very much. 30 feet is not very much. 60 feet is substantial. And at that point, I guess I would say that we're done with tree inventory, that the mitigation is done, the purpose of the tree ordinance has been fulfilled. Our subdivision ordinance, I feel like it's sought to balance those concerns for natural areas. And I feel like, yeah, so to me, that I don't think it's an arbitrary number at all, because the streets are going to be exempted from the tree ordinance and the building site area, but that means the houses will be a little bit closer to the front, which I think is exactly what our subdivision code and our tree ordinance would envision. So again, to be honest, when I look at how this thing was laid out, this was not laid out in a way that showed for me a lot of sensitivity to the topography, and that's a condition to me that makes it acceptable. So anyway, that's when we go to time of making motion, that's kind of the motion I would make, is that would be condition 7, but whatever the width number is on the street being that number.
And for a quick point, just so Mr. Moore doesn't have to pull it up, the projected tree inventory, I just remember it was $147,000 for any mitigation. So just food for thought, because we're bouncing between old agenda presentation items and current packet. So I just wanted to make sure folks knew, because I don't think that's in the new one. All right, so I have a few folks here. Mr. Keebler, Miss Reed. Actually, Mr. Keebler, if it's all right with you, I'm sure Miss Reed
Okay.
will want to stay on the same subject. So I'll let her briefly clarify anything, and then Mr. Keebler.
Sure, thank you. We're severely concerned about a 60-foot requirement off the back of the lot. As I mentioned in the original presentation to you, that these lots, what we envision is the homeowner and the builder going in. We don't want all the homes necessarily up at the building line. If there's a beautiful oak or an elm tree at the building line, we want the homeowner to push that home back so that they can preserve those trees. By putting a 60-foot restriction, or basically it's a setback from the rear property line, you're really restricting and limiting the ability of the homeowner and the builder to site by site select where they put the home and make it to the way they want it versus the way you want all the homes on the building setback. So we would ask that you keep it at 30 feet.
Thank you. Mr. Keebler?
David, I don't think you have any legal basis for what you're asking for. You might like it, but this is a build by right subdivision. And if they're willing to put the stub street in, you've got nothing to bargain with. And I think you're asking for too much, particularly when they could put in 2, 4, 6 times as many homes as they're asking to. And that would take down even more trees probably. So I think you're wrong about this. And I think legally, and we've been there before, you don't have a leg to stand on here. I'm sorry. This isn't a PUD. They're not asking for anything other than the fact of not putting in a stub street. And you're asking for too much.
All right. I'm gonna kind of sway us to emotion. The reason is I think that with the freshness of the tree ordinance and other things, there may be some disagreement or different levels of saturation with the content. So where we stand right now, and I'm looking at the current agenda, is the original conditions. There are 14 of them that I see. So in the interest of time, and Mr. Moore, you have free reign to interject, because some of these are codified and some of these are subjective. So I will rely on you to co-pilot this with me. But if folks will go to page, it begins on page 17 of the current packet. It's 18 in your PDF, but it's 17 numerically. The original conditions are number one, lots, and if I paraphrase, I apologize, they are written, but I'm doing it for brevity. Lots 20 and 21 shall have driveway access from the new public street, and a buffer at least 20 feet shall be provided. That is something that we have already discussed. And I saw Mr. Bracken, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to keep talking. I just wanted to point out that they actually, by requirement, would need 2 stub streets, not just one. And so we're, no matter what, making exception. And so I believe there can be some trade-off here between certain features that help and some that detriment to become something that we ultimately approve. That's all. Just wanted to put that out there.
No, thank you. And my moving the discussion along, I looked over to my side to a PDF. So thank you for thank you for waving your arm. All right. So as far as condition number 1, I am just going to quickly straw poll these until there's a need for discussion. Like I said, Mr. Moore is going to be my guardian on these to make sure that if it's codified, I don't let the commission have any leeway. So condition number 1 regarding lots 20 and 21. Is there any comment, or if there's no disagreement or visible, I will move on and assume folks are correct.
Which
Mr.
one are you
Keebler.
suggesting, Corey? The replacement?
No, if you,
On page 15, he's recommending a replacement for number 1.
oh, sorry. Thank you. I was looking at the original conditions. Mr. Moore, do you have these updated, or would you share that? Because I'm going between 2 documents.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So as the discussion was moving along, when it would come to a point where I felt like there was some agreement on replacing certain conditions or striking certain conditions, I have a list of those that I'm updating. So maybe that would be the easiest way.
We're toggling between 2, so that would be helpful.
So I'll go ahead and pull up that list for now. And if you'd like, I can go through and highlight exactly what I've heard up to this point. So with condition number 1, what I was hearing was the desire to strike that condition and just allow for those private homeowners put in whatever screening effect they desire. So essentially going with the applicant's desire to just have the street trees along Lake Forest and still have all the driveways off of the new public street, Arbor Edge Trail, but otherwise not have a buffer of any kind. That's what I heard previously. Not that that can change with a motion or be further refined with a straw poll. And then what I had also heard, so related to condition number 4, I don't think that there had been any objections to inserting in the staff revised language on that. So this doesn't require an HOA. An HOA is one such mechanism that could be accommodated through this condition, but this is there, as Mr. Perry put it, this is the reminder about section 411 of our subdivision code, that there needs to be some assurance of future maintenance funding from all residents of the subdivision for the stormwater management ponds. So that was condition 4. And then I think there was one other one that was updated so far, and that was condition number 11 for the extra buffering for lot 16. So this was going, again, kind of on the presumption that there wouldn't be an HOA, so there would be a dwelling located at that intersection, but allowing for a back of 100 feet from the center line. So I had inserted that in. So the way it stands at this point, and I'm actually going to go ahead and turn the bold off of condition 1. So as it reads in your memo, kind of the way that it might be helpful is anything that's in bold is potentially revisable per the memo. Anything that's not in bold seems like it's pretty well solid. So that's at least as it is in the memo, but as we see it on the screen here, I think only those conditions that are still in bold would be those that could potentially warrant further revision, either being inspired by the memo or going after some other new condition of some kind or some variation of what's in the memo.
So, Mr. Moore, I have basically the 2 unresolved, or the 2 discussable items are the stub and the 30 versus 40. So number 7 would address the 30-foot versus 40-foot. I believe number 8 would be in that one. And then number 13, if I'm reading correctly, addresses the stub. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. So conditions 7 and 8 address the conservation area restriction. Actually, so 7 addresses the eastern and southern edges, and then condition 8 was previously, it was just all about a rear yard setback. So that one has been recommended in the memo to include a similar restriction, but for an 80-foot width along the northern boundary. So those 2 conditions, 7 and 8, kind of go hand in hand with that topic. And then 13, as you said, that's correct, that goes with the stub street So that is the waiver for the connectivity index.
All right, thank you. Dr. Prithridge?
Just in part out of courtesy to Mr. Moore, because I think he and staff took a great deal of care in crafting these things. I wonder whether we can make all of them at least as motions, and if they fail because what we have is just exactly fine. But it might be a way of getting a vote. Like for condition 1, there is a proposed revision there in language, and like I could move that in a second. It failed for a second where people felt fine. I love the idea of consensus, but sometimes it's just nice to put it to a vote. And we're going to have to amend or strike anyway. So maybe that's a way to just, we've discussed a lot, so maybe it doesn't take a ton of discussion. But
No, and I'm not looking for consensus, but I was just trying to narrow down the remaining discussion points, because if we do them condition by condition, I think having 11 motions or 13 motions.
Oh no, I guess I'm just talking about the ones that are in black, and those are the, I guess I'm with Mr. Moore that the ones that we didn't talk about already, but I guess that's true.
Yeah, no, and I just like I said, in my mind, I think there's some relation. I'm seeing kind of a split. I'm seeing from the 7 folks, I'm seeing roughly half who are less concerned with the stub road and probably more concerned with the tree buffer, and then other folks who are either not vocal, non-committal, or haven't expressed. So I guess I could ask, if you go to, thank you, sir. If you go to the, and I'll just do a straw poll. Who here believes that some level of stub road should exist? Just raise your hand if you think some level should. Okay, so my hand was just for demonstration. It wasn't for a vote. So 3 of the 7. So if I'm reading that correctly, 4 of the 7 are less concerned with a stub road.
Are we talking about
any kind? It could be on paper, it could be in people's imagination, it could be a bike trail, but just any kind of stub road. Because if there's no consensus or no majority who care about a stub road, then what type of stub road is somewhat irrelevant. So I see 3 of the 7 folks who are interested.
So yeah, this is where, I guess to me, the idea of the motions and whether that's the straw poll, was that the case? Because I heard people that there was concern from right away from, how many of us? I don't know. If maybe you counted the votes, that's fine.
Well, I'm trying to go through this. So if you have a motion you'd like to make, you go ahead and make a motion that's exhaustive of all the conditions. And then
I don't think you can make a full motion at this point. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at. So I was trying to get some.
So why not just have a motion on each one of them and get them done?
Okay, Mr. Moore.
Start with number 1.
I agree with Mr. Keebler. I think what I would recommend is you always start with the recommendation at the top. So if it fails, then you just move to the next one, and you do the straw polls all the way through,
right?
And then a motion's made at the end. I think that would be the easiest way to gauge everybody's feelings on everything.
So actually that's what I was doing, but I was omitting the ones that were really not of any discussion worthiness or had already been addressed. All I was really looking for was trying to get the stub road and the 40-foot addressed, because everything else was already put to bed.
Let's just cover each one though for you. I would move that number 1 be eliminated.
Mr. Perry, would we have to do roll call votes on these, or are these just straw poll?
Yes.
So, Mr. Keebler, in the interest of time, would it just make sense to address the ones that are still pending? And I see that as 2.
Well, you've got 1, 2. I'm not sure whether that's true or not.
All right, Mr. Moore, go ahead and pull them up. We'll go one by one. I lose the ability to see everybody, so.
Yeah.
All right. By show of hands, who agrees with striking condition number 1?
Well, you can't see everybody, can you?
Nope, you don't have to toggle back. I just changed my view. So I have 4. So 4 people, majority rules. Mr. Moore, you don't have to toggle. I've split the view. All right, number 2, I believe, is codified. So if folks raise your hand if you believe it should stay.
I thought all we were doing was the ones that were highlighted on your printed packet.
Yes, that's what I said. And everyone
That's
said, no, let's
number
go
4.
through them.
That's number 4 is the next one.
Okay, so number 4, basically the water retention. If you agree with condition 4 as Zach has presented it, go ahead and raise your hand.
And is 4, I'm sorry, is 4 as it appears on 17 is not the language. Is that the language, Zach, that you proposed elsewhere, or I'm toggling back and forth between?
Yeah, condition number 4 that appears right here is as is currently recommended in the memo.
Okay, I'm sorry, thank you. So yeah.
And Zach, if you could indicate that that's just for the record or for some continuity, because there's no delineation between 2, 3, and 4 or 5 and 6 as far as visible. They all appear the same.
But this one doesn't, the condition as it appears in 4 does not ensure that it's borne by all people in the subdivision. The one that he proposes at the top of page 17 is the one that I think we were discussing, which is a mechanism, an organization that would take it on. So sometimes we could be voting on the proposed amendments to.
What I'm going off is what is visibly being broadcast and recorded and on our screens right now.
Okay.
Because there are 5.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I was looking at my packet and okay.
Yep. Yeah, I'm going off what is commonly presented and visible to the public. Okay. So it says document related to stormwater management to ensure the funding and future funding of future maintenance. That one.
All resident.
Yep.
Right.
All right. So raise your hand if you are in agreement with condition 4. All right. I see a majority. The next I have are 7 and 8, which are together, and that basically is what I'd referred to as the green line zone that Zach presented. To quick synopsis, number 8 provides for an 80-foot buffer on the north border, and number 7 provides for, if I'm not mistaken, both the southern and eastern border of 40 feet. So if you were in agreement with Zach's presentation of 40 feet, 80 at the north, 40 at the south and east, please raise your hand. All right, I'm seeing a majority for that. Okay, Zach, can you go down to condition 13? And this is the stub road. So currently by ordinance, there would have to be 2 stubs if I heard Mr. Moore correctly. The proposal for city staff was to have any number of different options ranging from a paper stub, an easement, a modified, which Zach presented as a 2/3 stub with the 45-degree circles, or a traditional stub road that will basically dead end at a tree. So this is not something I don't want to go down the 4 options. That's why I was asking if at this point I'm going to start with, I would like to see a raise of hands, folks who are interested or would like to have the requirement of some level of a stub road in whatever fashion you choose. If you want a stub road as a yes, please raise your hand. All right, I have 4. So that means we now need to go through and figure out which variety. Mr. Moore, would you help me out and go back to your options of the different stub roads? We know this is condition 13.
Yes, certainly, Mr. Chair. Let me go ahead and pull that up for you. Okay. Okay, so the screen that I have showing here, so condition 13 worded right here is the option for the 2/3 stub. And then condition 13 in the middle here is for the paper street only. Between lots 5 and 6 is where that's recommended. And then 13 at the bottom, the least amount of text for that one, it's just granting the waiver as presented. So no stub street, no paper street.
Didn't we also talk about an option of what would be D, which is an easement for 10-foot wide multi-use path?
That did come up in discussion. So if at this point, I think I would entertain not a formal motion, but one of the commissioners to basically throw their idea out of what they prefer, and then we can talk from there. Because the only other mechanism in Parley Pro would be to have somebody make a formal motion that if people disagree with, they can amend. So instead of me toggling in somewhat obscurity through 4 to 5 and possibly an unknown 6th option, I think it would be incumbent on the commission for somebody to pretty much throw out the first bid, so to speak. Mr. Dana, then Mr. Bracken.
I will throw out B, paper street only.
All right. Mr. Bracken.
Would it be possible to just grant them the option of anything that allows with ease to future connectivity?
I think that would be possible, but I would strongly encourage the caveat that, and it's probably redundant, that it's approved by the law director and city staff or signed off by the chair or vice chair, similar to like a minor amendment would be handled in other scenarios, just so that it's not obscure. Mr. Perry?
I was just going to say that I've had that same idea that Mr. Bracken did, and I think what we could do is, I don't know if there's enough commission members that would, support that, but we could then take that condition and then meet with the applicant to say, this is the direction. And then when we go to council, if this were to be recommended for approval, then we could provide the updated information as to whether it's a multi-use path or a 15-foot easement or whatever the details, rather than trying to engineer it on the fly.
I think that's very appropriate.
Makes good sense.
Yeah, so if there are motions, I would second Mr. Dana's motion for a paper street, but with the flexibility that you're describing.
Mr.
Amen.
Keebler? Mr. Keebler, did you have a comment? I thought I saw your hand.
Or maybe we could make it a paper connection.
All right. So, Mr. Bracken, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, the issue was it will be very hard to get back later if that becomes private property without any explicit requirements that we can make a connection there. So I'm for giving the developers any option they want, as long as that connection remains truly viable and is not problematic in the future.
Okay. So I heard two things, and I just want to rein this in. Quickly, Mr. Dana had thrown out a paper street, or the paper street option, and then Mr. Bracken had thrown out some level with flexibility approval, obviously with the city staff and the law director. So just real quick, and I'm going to have to do this in an ugly fashion. Who would like a paper street? Just draw a poll, raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. And who is open to some level of connectivity to be determined and approved by the city staff, law director, and presented to council for a specific approval? Okay, so there's actually 4 of us on that one. So that seems to be what has won. So at this point, I think we have straw polled the death out of these couple conditions, or what, 13, 14 conditions. So it would make the most sense, and this will have to be something that we capture the conditions. I believe, Mr. Moore, you've captured them adequately. So I will,
Yep,
Ms.
but
Reed,
Ms. Reed, yeah.
Ms. Reed.
Yes, there's one condition we haven't addressed, and we talked a lot about it, was lot 16. Staff had made a recommendation to reword condition number 11. We had agreed to the additional setbacks and the access on Lake Forest Drive for lot 16, and that was covered in condition number 11, and so that has not been modified. So I want to make sure I got that in there before you made a motion.
I think we all agreed with that.
Yeah, I think, I believe we had agreed, we had discussed. I have that we were in agreement. If I missed something, somebody.
Right, but his condition 11 here on this original conditions sheet is not been modified. It still restricts lot 16 to not having access. And there's none, and I'll be honest, none of these conditions that I see written here, 1 through 14, say anything about the additional setbacks for lot 16. Okay, so it's there. Okay,
yeah,
I was
yeah.
just looking at the memo that he had
In
provided
number
to me.
11
I
on
apologize.
page 16.
Yeah, so
Gotcha.
simply because we're modifying things to capture the discussion, my predecessor and I have always relied on Mr. Moore or Mr. Perry to capture the updated discussion, so that if and when we vote on the conditions, that we have the presented agenda, and then we have the captured version of what was spoken to. So, Mr. Moore, if you could keep these up, I will entertain a motion to approve. Well, actually, I'll entertain a motion to approve, disapprove, table, whatever folks want to do. Mr. Keebler.
Approve with conditions as agreed to.
A second.
All right, Mr. Keebler makes the motion, Ms. Rosenberg seconds it. Just for the record, the conditions are what Mr. Moore has presented on the screen, which is visible in the recording and on YouTube. It's a Word document entitled SFE Conditions. It strikes number 1 and modifies 2 through 14. So just so we're all looking at the same ones, Mr. Moore.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, just based on the feedback that we've heard on condition 13. So I went ahead and left the connectivity index going from 1.2 to 0.5 because I believe that standard addresses street connectivity. So if we're talking about a pedestrian connection or a bike path, I think it's okay to leave it in there as is, but simply stating the condition that the accessibility and connectivity, and this was kind of wording that I came up with on the fly, that accessibility or connectivity of some kind be explored and an adequate solution reached between the applicant, city staff, and the law director. So I just wanted everyone to be clear that that's how I reworded that condition.
And just for clarity, the 1.2 to 0.5 was on your slide in your presentation with the 1 versus 2. So that's where those numbers come from for folks who don't have that handy. All right, so we have a motion on the table by Mr. Keebler, seconded by Ms. Rosenberg. Is there any other discussion? So I will take that. Mr. Perry, did you have something, or did your mouse win the microphone war? All right. So seeing no other discussion, questions, comments, or concerns, I will take that as calling the question. And this is a roll call vote. So Mr. Perry, you have the mic.
And can I just repeat who the motion and the second was, just for the record?
Yes, the motion was Mr. Keebler. The second was Ms. Rosenberg.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll start with Mr. Bracken.
Yes.
Mr. Prithridge,
Yes.
Ms. Blackmore,
Yes.
Mr. Dana,
Yes.
Mr. Keebler,
Yes.
Ms. Rosenberg,
Yes.
and Mr. Watt.
Yes. All right, so the motion passes. Thank you. We will now move into new business. Mr. Moore, quick question. Actually, do folks want to take a quick recess?
I was about to request, I need a drink really bad.
I need to refill my stadium cup. According to the record, it is 9:15 Eastern time. I will see everybody back at 9:20. So I'm not sure if Sam has to kill the recording, but please turn off your mics and cameras. See you in 5. As soon as Mr. Keebler and Mr. Bracken come back, we can continue. So we will continue with new business and we'll go back to the format that everyone is warm, cozy, and fuzzy with.
Which is,
Not having to repeat the discussion that we had a month
right.
earlier.
Good. Have mercy on you.
All right, we are all back. It is 9:21, so we have shown grace with the clock. All right, we will move into new business with PC 2021-03 is a lot split and consolidation at 20 East High, 50 East Park Place. Bear Becker, surveyor. I will accept a motion to adjourn to public hearing.
I so move.
Mr. Dana moved, Ms. Blackmar second. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Except for Mr. Keebler, I have all hands. Hey, there, I got Mr. Keebler. All right, perfect. Mr. Moore, you have the floor.
Actually, I'll take this one if that's okay.
Mr. Perry, I'm sorry, I forgot.
They let me do staff reports still. So Mr. Moore does a great job, but I get to do one every now and then. So I have a request tonight from Sigma Chi that has been drawn by Brian Johnson with Bear Becker Surveyors, and they're waiting in the audience if needed. John Price is representing Sigma Chi, so I will share a screen here to show you just a couple slides to familiarize you with the area. So you're all familiar with the former Bill's Art Store. It was known for many years. This is the Sigma Chi founding location. And there was a building to the rear part that was attached that was removed several years ago around 2014. And there has been an effort to transfer the remnant of that property. So if you can see my cursor, there was a remaining part of this building here that was removed, and this property has been vacant for several years. And this is their founding site that they have restored and would like to retain. And their proposal is to sell off the rear portion. And so you can see the drawing here that shows the split and the consolidation. So this is actually two functions. And those of you that don't have the pleasure of reviewing these administrative approvals like Mr. Watt does, then don't get to see this very often. But there exists already a split. There are already two parcels here. Their proposal is to split the southern parcel, or the part where the addition has been put on to their founding site, and then combine that with the northern parcel and sell that entire piece. So this line would be removed and this larger piece would be left. There's a minimum lot size requirement in the Uptown District of 3,000 square feet. The southern portion is already under that. It's 2,800. The result of the split would make that even smaller. So the request is to take that existing nonconformity and make it even more nonconforming. And so if you saw my staff report, we don't believe that this is a concern because there's not as really a great need for this minimum lot size because of the Uptown District doesn't have site setbacks. There's already a floor area ratio. There's already a density standard for occupants. So this is really a leftover requirement that I believe came from changes that were made back in 2007 and 8. So I can leave that on the screen. We can discuss. Mr. Price is available to answer any questions if needed, and Brian Johnson as well. I can check and see if they're still in the audience. But to make a long story short, this is essentially a variance on a lot size, and our determination was that the Board of Zoning Appeals doesn't have really the authority to make this decision. The Planning Commission, by law and by statute, is the platting authority. So the Planning Commission needs to make this decision and essentially allow staff to administratively approve this. We did, because of the conditions of the building and the way the addition was put onto it, there is a utility area there, and we believe it's reasonable to ask for that. They have agreed to that. There's some HVAC equipment, and there's a need for trash provisions, as we know uptown. That's a constant issue with providing land and space for trash so that it's not being dealt with by the general public and by the city. So that little strip of land is there, and they've agreed to provide an easement for it. That is an encumbrance on the buyer. They won't be able to use that portion of the property, but they have agreed to this transaction prior to doing the lot split. So this is kind of a cleanup effort that we're trying to work with them on. And the other issue is the city engineer noted that there's an encroachment. They're all aware of that. We haven't got a response yet from them on whether they would be willing to grant an easement for that encroachment from the neighbor. But that is an additional issue as well. They were aware of that. As part of the demolition and the addition, they had to reconstruct or build a supporting wall. Many of the buildings uptown don't have their own demising walls. So there had to be some construction happen for that. That resulted in the encroachment several years ago. So that's not been agreed to yet at this point. We think we can work through that, but the other easement has been. And so the main issue is reducing the lot size under the 3,000 square feet even further. So happy to answer any questions or turn it over to Mr. Price or Johnson.
What I get for being polite and muting. Are there any questions for Mr. Perry? If not, I will gladly let the applicant or representative talk. I don't see any. So Mr. Johnson, if you would like to address the commission.
This is Mr. Price. I apologize. I am on the line, and I think Sam did an excellent job of explaining the situation. So happy to address any questions. And the comment was received, or the question was received on the encroachment prior to the meeting, and given travel schedules, I've not been able to respond, but I do not anticipate that being an issue. So we'll be happy to work through that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Price. Are there any questions for Mr. Price? All right. Mr. Perry, would you see if there's anybody in the public that would like to speak to this issue?
No hands raised. We do have one virtual attendee, but no hands raised at this time.
All right. Seeing no questions for staff, the applicant, or no comments from the public, I will entertain a motion to close public comment. I'm taking Mr. Keebler as a motion, and I will take Mr. Dana as a second. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Let the record show all commissioners raise their hand in the affirmative. All right. So discussion on this matter. Dr. Prithridge, you're muted, sir.
Do we need a motion first to close public hearing? Do you have a motion on the?
I always thought we did, David, but lately they've been discussing before the motion.
Mr. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you can motion in a second and discuss, right? Does it matter?
It's a tomato. The order I have is one that has been on this commission for years, to the best of my knowledge. I grew up with the make a motion first, but I'll entertain a motion if folks want to make.
I think it's pretty straightforward, so I'm going to move that we approve PC 2021-03.
I second.
All right, Mr. Keebler beat you to it, Mr. Dana. I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All right, I don't see any discussion, so I will, any indication of discussion, so I will take that as a call of the question. Mr. Perry, will you call the roll?
Will do. Ms. Rosenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Bracken?
Yes.
Mr. Prithridge?
Yes.
Mr. Keebler?
Yes.
Ms. Blackmore?
Yes.
Mr. Dana?
Yes.
And Mr. Watt?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, let me get back to the agenda.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate your patience.
No problem. No problem. Absent anything else from me, I'll sign out.
Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good evening, guys.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Perry, would you or Mr. Moore like to speak briefly to the administrative approvals?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. The lot consolidation is pretty typical. It's an odd configuration, but it was already approved. The minor amendment, the memo that I put in there saying that it was previously approved in no way represents the number of staff hours that was spent on this. So Mr. Moore spent a lot of time working with the architect, the contractor, the owner of the company for Dairy Queen, 5046 College Corner Pike. So this resulted in an administrative approval, but there was a fair bit of negotiation back and forth. And kudos to Mr. Moore for that. And like I said, it's already been approved, and there should be starting construction here in a matter of days on that property. A former Chef Lynn's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. So good reuse of property.
Perfect. Also, one thing I want to say is the order of business is something that there is some variation amongst the committees. I will work with Mr. Mazur because I was raised in a different Parley Pro scenario. So I was merely continuing what I had inherited. And I do see benefits to it because normally we have conditions, but Mr. Mazur and I will go grab a cup of coffee and chit chat Parley Pro. So I just wanted to say that for anyone who has concerns about the order of events. All right. Well, if there is no other business, I will happily entertain a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
Mr. Data wins the motion. Is there a second? Ms. Blackmar, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Show of hands, all those in favor of adjourning. Let the record show all commissioners raise their hands. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and staff and everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Aye.
Work, Nick Keebler.